Thanks everyone for being here. So I would rather people stop me and ask lots of questions than get through the content I have here. So please feel free to stop and ask questions at any point. I'm gonna, in particular, talk about one sub-area of research that I think about, but also something that's been getting a lot of media attention in the last couple of years, which is to say machine learning and sort of how well or well it does not work in a variety of specific applications. Okay, so you all are spending some time in the Bay Area, so you've probably heard pitches about machine learning being used in almost any domain you can possibly imagine. So, you know, machine learning is being pitched as sort of the magic beans of all sorts of different things. You know, there are people who are saying that we'll be able to predict wine quality quite well, and I'm sure there are startups which are trying to do things like this or try to predict your taste in wine based on your prior desires in terms of wine. There are lots of examples of sort of more silly applications. These don't look so good on this slide, but generating pictures of cats, like little silly cartoon pictures of cats, as well as, in many cases, looking at how well one can, these are much smaller on this than I remember, looking at how to personalize a customer's experience when interacting with some company, right? There's also lots of people who are hoping to use machine learning to do a better job pricing anything you can imagine. For example, secondhand cars, right? So I give this as an example because we've been selling secondhand cars for a long time, and at least some fraction of the population thinks we know how to do that. And yet there are people who think it can be done more efficiently or machine learning methods. This is one of my favorites. So someone has decided it would be humorous to try to use basic machine learning methods to try to, from images of marijuana plants, predict which of them are going to get sick with common diseases for those. I can't attest to the veracity of any of their results or how they came to them.
Martin. I cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry. I was asked whether the people who were considering machine learning for such uses were inebriated in some way, and I'm not sure if that's the case. So one might think this would be a bit of an overkill in terms of an example where one might want to use machine learning, but recently, as in like within the last year, Microsoft announced that they'd be using machine learning to try to predict when they should offer updates to their software so as to not annoy the user of the system, right? So rather than that popping up while you're making some kind of presentation and you having to click on the thing, they thought machine learning would be like a more appropriate way to predict whether someone was actively using their system or not. You might say that's a bit of overkill, right? There are other things one could do. Lots of medical groups are hoping that AI and various forms of machine learning will help them do a better job in terms of all kinds of patient care, right? Both in terms of medical studies, but then also in terms of, you know, the way actual caregivers interact with actual patients, right? There's also the tacit hope that machine learning methods will be more objective when it comes to doing all sorts of different tasks than humans making those same sorts of choices. There are any number of startups that are employing machine learning to sift through large numbers of resumes for both low and high skilled workers. And the hope in each of these cases, if not the second or third line of those pitches, is that AI could actually do a better job reducing the bias in terms of the machine learning, in terms of the people one brings in for an interview. Okay, I have many other examples. Right, this is just yeah. So yeah, no, many examples. So it's true that like machines might do a better job processing certain kinds of images than human eyes. They have the capacity for actually doing a lot more processing on pixels, right? Yeah, people have also thought about sort of whether machine learning can do a better job pricing real estate and any other possible thing you could possibly imagine, right? I have a few others. Okay. On the other hand, simultaneous in the last like 5 or so years to this really explosive adoption of machine learning technologies in almost any domain you can imagine have been a bunch of examples, which you guys have probably heard at least to some extent about, right? So one example is, so you all presumably know that Google matches our ads, tries to personalize them based on all sorts of information they have about us, and based on the preferences of advertisers, right? But it does some non-trivial matching, often based on statistical information, and a number of different things have been found that may be considered problematic. For example, there's some recent work that has shown that lots of high-paying job advertisements are much more likely to be shown to profiles that are considered male as opposed to female. There's now mounting evidence that any number of pieces of statistical software which are being used in the criminal justice space as broadly as one could imagine have different levels of predictive power for different demographic groups, right? So this is just a screenshot of one part of a ProPublica article about a specific example of this, one that's rather contentious, but from policing to sentencing to bail decisions and all sorts of risk management systems, there are definite questions as to the veracity of the claims that are being made by the companies who are making this kind of software. So this will come up again later in the talk, I think, if we get there. But one of the earlier fun things that Google was doing with the huge number of images that it had uploaded, it had access to when crawling the web, was trying to auto-tag them with all sorts of things about the subjects in those images. And I'll show you the example much later for a different reason. But there was one young woman who noticed that images of herself and her friends were being labeled as gorillas. And that's particularly problematic given that these people were African American. It's not great, and it would be a mistake if we were labeling any images of humans gorillas, because that's an error, but there's an additional social cost when that comes, when one's actually thinking about the historical basis for such behavior. Okay, I won't just rag on one large tech company. Amazon was using some, secret in-house machine learning model to try to guess who would be the top AI talent to try to hire. And it was doing a much worse job predicting the quality of research for women than for men. And there are many, many, many other examples, but I'll maybe give you a few more that are not so tech-focused, right? So as I mentioned, one of the places in which people are thinking about machine learning really improving our day-to-day lives as opposed to our online lives is this idea that medicine and our medical care providers could use tools developed with statistics involved to give better care to our patients, right? And there's preliminary evidence that we may see problems as a result of that, right? So we already have a lot of evidence, ignoring machine learning systems in general, that quality of care varies wildly when you look at different demographic groups. Rich white men tend to get the best care out of the US medical system compared to anyone else. And we seem to be seeing similar results when it comes to looking at ML methods that are based on any number of different kinds of historical pieces of data. I think part of the problem and part of the real concern is that so much of the machine learning that people are doing and saying will fix things is in general thought of as very black box and very proprietary. And it's not in general, right, when a large company spends a lot of money investing in some kind of machine learning system, they don't in general want to be very open about how it works, why it works, the data it was trained upon. They don't in general want to, yeah?
So apparently most of the people at AI neglected to read Fred Brooks' mythical Magma, which pointed out that the, I'm trying to remember the exact words, but basically something to the effect of the structure of, and values of a system reflect those that built it, as an example.
So right. So the comment here is, am I doing the right thing? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm just going to correct it. It's not Fred Brooks. It's Mel Conway, and his theorem said that the structure of the organization producing the software is reflected in the software.
Right. And right. So it's certainly the case that if you are a collection of people, you're most likely to produce some software or artifact in general that represents the values that you as a group already exhibit, right? And that's certainly either explicitly or tacitly the case in a lot of these. Yeah.
So the machine learning systems that work off a base of examples which are then used for training generate decisions based on what it finds in the sample and not in the algorithm itself?
That's not clear. I'll say a little bit more about that.
You're gonna have to repeat.
Yeah. So the question was, I think, let me rephrase and see if you're happy with my rephrasing. Machine learning systems in general look at trends they find in their training data and then try to make predictions based on the trends they find in that training data. And while that is true, it is not entirely clear that all of the behavior we're seeing here is entirely the result of trends we see in the data. That is almost certainly part of the problem in some of these cases. But that's also sort of, it's not looking at all of the possible sources of this kind of behavior. Yeah. There are many other examples. This is one of my favorites. It was in the news not too long ago, where to poke fun again at one of the large tech companies, Amazon's facial recognition system, when run on the headshots of the members of Congress, had a huge number of false positives when matching the facial shots of members of Congress to their criminal database.
Maybe they're right.
Sure, but like different people, right? So there were a huge number of false positives, and the number of false positives amongst Congress people of color was nearly twice the rate it should have been, compared to the rate of false positives of Caucasian Congress people, okay? And the ACLU did this study, right? And that seems to be somewhat problematic. We could go on and on. There's another example where, if you're using machine learning to do something like predict skin cancer, you should make sure that you have a pretty representative sample of people with different types of skin. There are lots of examples where if you don't, you will have some problems in terms of your predictive power. Yeah, so one final thing, which I briefly mentioned before, there are a lot of people who really want to use histories of arrests as, recent histories of arrests as a strong indicator that one should send future limited police resources into a neighborhood, right? So if what you say is, I know that we arrested a bunch of people for crime X in this location, that means that we should send more police into that location to look for crime X and maybe other crimes as well. there are all sorts of problems that come from systems that work that way, especially given that we don't arrest people for the same sorts of crimes at equal rates in different communities, right? And that can lead to the idea, drug use, illicit drug use, is roughly equal across different demographic groups conditioned on socioeconomic status, right? 5-ish%. But the rate at which we put people in prison for it is very, very much not evenly distributed. Okay. So if we then use where we arrested people for those particular crimes as justification to going into those neighborhoods and sending additional police to look for more crime, we may never find the crime in other neighborhoods, which may be happening at the same or even greater rates. Okay. Okay. So that is to say, we have some explaining to do. We, as people who are sellers or people who are encouraging the adoption of machine learning. And I think the short answer to why we might be seeing some of this behavior is that we don't know how many of these machine learning systems work. We as users as opposed to the producers. But that also extends in many cases to the people who are actually developing these machine learning models. It's not at all clear that in a lot of these cases they expected the behavior that is being pointed out, right? And there's mounting evidence that some of these systems, as I mentioned, have very different predictive quality for different demographic groups. And as Dennis alluded to a moment ago, it's not entirely clear why. I mean, there is at least one answer that may be at least sometimes responsible, but it's not clear if this is the result of the choice of algorithms we're using to optimize, or whether it's the result of the choice of models we're optimizing over, right? So maybe we're using linear models, which are a perfect predictor based on the set of features we have for some populations, but somehow that we really needed, we needed something slightly different for a different demographic group. It's not clear if this is an inevitability due to differences in the distributions over the set of features we have for different demographic groups, right? If we are going to allow ourselves to use machine learning in these particular contexts. It's not clear if this is the result of, if you take a random sample of the United States and it was perfectly representative, we would still have more people of certain demographic groups than others, which means we have more statistical power to talk about the larger groups than the smaller groups for anything we learn from that data set. And it's not clear if what we're seeing is primarily the result of having far more uncertainty about smaller populations, right? One of the things that people speak about a lot is stakeholders and who's in the room when they're making decisions about what kind of models to use, right? So if you walk into any of these tech firms, you're not going to see a representative slice of the American population, nor will you see them gathering data in Iowa or Louisiana. They'll be driving cars to look for data outside of Stanford. Yeah.
Just to point out, these models are not just used in the United States.
No.
So the model that's developed by somebody in California is going to be used in Africa.
Could be, yeah.
You might want to
Yeah.
put that in a microphone.
Oh, yes. So the point was, if we're developing a model in Palo Alto, it's not the case that we're imagining it only being deployed in Palo Alto, right? Lots of these organizations are hoping to train something here and then deploy it much more broadly, for example, in Africa. And there are so many things that are problematic about that, even if we weren't thinking about anything that had to do with humans, right? The temperature and amount of sunlight and amount of humidity and the type of roads and the type of things that everything about this environment will affect the way a system that is developed here based on data collected here will work, and systems will work much less well when any of those things change, right? So if you train a model on data all gathered here and then hope to deploy it somewhere very different, there is no reasonable expectation that you should have that it should work very well. Yeah, and that's a very good point. So we don't fully understand which of all of these different sets of things is primarily responsible, if anyone is primarily responsible for this sort of behavior we're seeing, right? And that seems pretty problematic, right? Because these different reasons for this behavior would suggest very different interventions, right? At least from my perspective, right? They would perhaps recommend different types of data collection or different types of model selection. Yeah. Okay. So more broadly, I'm very interested in understanding when and why machine learning algorithms treat different demographic groups differently, and whether it's possible to make them robust to moderate demographic changes, right? So taking something and training, yeah, yes?
How about better testing?
Better testing is, okay, so the question was, how about better testing? That's certainly going to be one of the things that we're going to need to do, and one of the recommendations I have for systems in general, right? If you want to deploy a system in a given environment, you probably should have tested it in an environment that is somewhat analogous. That is definitely something that one should consider. Yeah. Yes.
So your comments have an underlying model that the algorithms being used for machine learning have a sort of, they're tailored to a particular problem and operate in a consistent way over time. My experience is that they're a framework which is essentially a great family of algorithms which gets tailored by the data that's trained into the system. And so not only do we not have control over the framework itself after a while, but we have no understanding of how things are working underneath.
Right.
Except for the fact that we look at the output of the learning. And that tells us something about whether or not we're doing it, quote, right or not right, because we match it against an expected result. So it's really the input data and expected result that are the knobs that can be turned, and everything else is self-organized.
Right. So let me again rephrase and see if you like the rephrasing I use. So if we posit that in the world there are some set of machine learning mechanisms, right? Stochastic gradient descent, SVMs, a few other like really simple. I get shaking heads, but you know the five. Yeah, but like there are like, let's imagine there are 5 or 6 optimization methods that everyone's agreed upon are like the only ones you ever need. And there are 5 or 6 classes of models that are the only ones you would ever need. And then the question is, on what data will you train these models with these optimization procedures so as to get a model out which does particularly well on a particular task when data is generated in some similar way to the data that you actually trained upon. And that's certainly one way to look at machine learning. And it's certainly the case that if your input data does not match the environment in which your model will be deployed, you will be able to say very little about how that system will perform. But even if it does match reasonably well, a lot of the optimization procedures and models people tend to use have some of this problematic behavior which may or may not be entirely explained by the training data used, right? And I also don't like to give up the agency of people who are using these things. They have a lot of control over what they're going to use, what they're going to optimize over, and with what. Okay, so I've given lots of examples about concerns of uses of machine learning, both due to different and worse treatment of different groups and people, as well as the context and opacity of the uses of those systems, right? So we've sort of tacitly been bantering about a couple of different things, and I want to be slightly more precise. So when we say machine learning systems are unfair, what people usually mean one of two things, right? One of the things they might mean is that the predictions have much higher error rates on different demographic groups, which is to say we're seeing images labeled gorilla at much higher rates for certain demographic groups than other demographic groups. That's one type of behavior that people often refer to as unfair, but it is not the only one, right? Separately, if you just think about the set of predictions a machine learning model is choosing amongst, and you break out the rates of those different predictions that the model is making by different demographic groups, the model might be making no mistakes, but might be making predictions of those different outcomes at very different rates over different demographic groups, right? And I think we really have to grapple with whether that is something we want to consider acceptable or unacceptable behavior, and it will depend on the context. Yes?
Can you define what you mean by rate?
Yes. So what I mean is take a random sample of an example that the model will be operating upon from two different demographic groups, right? Random sample generated perhaps from like the same data generating process as the model was trained upon, and look at the probability with which that random example would be assigned 1 or 0 in a simple binary prediction case.
It occurs to me that there's actually a third class of error, of where we'd call it unfair. So we're evaluating according to one set of criteria. The system was optimized with respect to making a different value judgment.
Yes.
And
Yes.
when you don't like the system as a whole anyway, no matter how well it's performing, if you're choosing a different value function, then of course it's wrong.
Right. And I think that's a good point. That's like, yes, that's absolutely a third set of concerns, which is to say, if we're imagining that we're optimizing this model to maximize the number of arrests that we make that lead to eventual convictions, right? I'm just hypothesizing something that someone might want to maximize if one was thinking about using a machine learning system for example, predictive policing, right? That is a very explicit value choice, right? And that may very well not be one that all communities agree are the right ones. I do want to give, at least a small amount of voice to the idea that some machine learning experts really don't think that this is a concern, right? In fact, there are certain people in the machine learning community, both practitioners and academics, who basically say, okay, it's true, machine learning systems may have different rates of predictions, may have different error rates, but they do better than humans making those decisions. And I want to be clear that the community is not at total consensus, okay? But my point is we really need to think about precisely how these algorithms are going to be designed and used, right? That statement is an imprecise one, right? And if we're thinking about humans interacting with these machine learning systems to try to make various types of decisions, it's really important that we think about precisely how that works, because humans behave in very unexpected ways. And it's not as though a human in a given environment making a set of choices, when augmented with additional helpful information or even unhelpful information, will always make better choices. That's not, there's not a great deal of evidence of that. In fact, there's lots of evidence to the contrary, right? So if you have a judge who's making choices about bail and you give them some signal about the people they're making judgments about, and that signal, whether that signal is useful or not, they will behave differently with that signal in hand when they're making those choices, right? And humans are just very counterintuitive, right? Judges are much stricter right before lunch. And so, I get hangry, it's fine. But I'm also not sending people to prison, so maybe that's okay. So I think we really have to think carefully, as was mentioned before, about piloting and very carefully testing any model we design in as close to an environment as possible as we are imagining it being deployed, right? Not just in a black box looking at like some simple statistics, but also like if we're going to give judges some recidivism tool, we have to think about how they'll interact with it. Yeah.
Well, when supersonic aircraft, in fact, were first built, many of the first test pilots were the guys who killed them, who designed them. Jeffrey de Havilland probably most notably. So the thing to do, I mean, what happened, of course, back a couple of decades, were attempts to do case-based reasoning studies, I believe, on pathogens. So maybe the thing to do is we administer a pathogen to you, and you get to figure out what disease we've given you. And if you survive, evolution allows your algorithm to come ahead. Otherwise, well, you know, you try.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the problem is we've developed, because we can always reset our various simulations and games, multiple lives, and which is not a bad thing, mind you. But so, how should we? I mean, how are we to speak to you guys who develop these machine language systems when we have this past history of basically infinite lives to be able to reset and rethink about how some of these systems should work?
Right. I think, so the comment was one about the people who are in general developing technologies have often been their own guinea pigs, which seems somewhat more just than requiring someone else to be the guinea pig for something you've developed, which you may or may not understand or have complete faith in its veracity. I think that's an interesting comment. Part of the concern with any of these things is that they're making high stakes decisions that aren't so clear how to do that with, right? So most of the people who are building AI systems aren't likely to be involved in low-level criminal conviction cases, right? I'm not saying that they shouldn't be, I'm just saying statistically speaking, that's not something that they regularly interact with, right? You can give anyone a disease, it's pretty hard to like place someone in a criminal justice system and try to get, you know, some tool, like have them subject to the outcomes of their own tool. Yeah. Yes?
Jeremy, don't you think that there's a problem here relating to causality? Correlation is one of the things that are used to drive the training process. The analysis doesn't always go to causality.
Yep.
And so you have causality as a feature in the learning process, and suppose it gets captured, then we take the result and we apply it to quite a different context, which is, say, the sentencing situation you have here. The judge comes back from lunch and feels good and happy and is much more congenial, and that has nothing to do with the facts of the matter. It simply says, well, we'll let him off this time. Mm-hmm. And AIs might do similar sorts of things.
That's right. Very, very little of the most popular pieces of machine learning in both industry and academia do much of any reasoning about causality in any real way, right? So the real question is, are the set of trends that these models are predicting, are they causal? Is the fact that, you know, right, so causality, hands raised if people know what causality is. Okay, so in general, this idea that like, does the thing we're looking at to try to predict whether someone will commit a crime if I let them out, is that merely a statistical pattern? Or is it the fact that I see these certain behaviors in their history and that in fact causes them to be more likely, not just happens to co-occur with recidivism rates, for example? Yeah.
So you use the word trend, and that's also, so it's a time series. And so one of the things that happens with these is it works as long as there's no structural change in the environment. And the best example I have of that is the first machine learning system that was deployed for machine trading.
Yeah,
Tokyo.
yeah.
And it worked really well until it stopped working, and it lost $1 million a minute.
Yeah.
There was no way to turn it off.
Yeah.
So there is a video in Japan, shot by NTT, of a man walking around with a hatchet, cutting cables to disable the machine learning system so they could stop losing money.
That's right. So we're poking at a few different things here, right? This comment was that, I've been very loose with my words in terms of I've been using trend. I'm not explicitly trying to say anything temporal with that phrase, although it is the case that if we're imagining deploying a system, when things change, its behavior will change too, or at least its efficacy is likely to change, right? So the example given that if you design a trading system based on certain historical trends, it may make you a bunch of money for a little while, but it is unlikely to make you a lot of money for very long. That's an interesting comment. Yeah.
In the real world, who designs these algorithms?
In the real world?
Yeah, in the real world.
It's all my fault.
Yeah. So the question being, who designs these things? And that's one of the things that's very interesting. There's simultaneously a big push for what people call the democratization of AI, which is to say making it as easy as possible for as many people as possible to train models on any data set they might have. And while I am sympathetic to the idea that we should try to make the tools we're developing accessible to lots of people and train people how to use them, allowing people who know little to nothing about statistics and little to nothing about the consequences of the prediction task they're training a model to do, or the historical context, is hugely problematic, right? And many of the people in the real world, there are people who are using PyTorch packages that maybe took undergrad computer science classes and maybe took some statistics classes, but are in no way equipped to be making some of the value judgments in terms of trade-offs of what objective function they're actually optimizing or anything else. They're just doing something which seems to work better than some basic if-then-else that they could program without looking at historical data. And there are very few rules and regulations as to who would be making such choices. Right? There are a few exceptions, right? But yeah.
You talk about validation. You know about validation.
Yes, I know about validation.
You'd rather not talk about it.
No. I wouldn't rather not talk about it.
No, I'm sorry.
Yes. So I've said.
We don't have to talk about it.
Okay, I'm happy to talk about validation.
One of my major objections.
Sure. Well, right. In general, if people design some machine learning system and train it on some data, there's a big concern that you've overfit to your data, and one of the many methods for trying to prevent and mitigate that is checking how well your model works on data it did not see in training. Okay? They have. Who is they, and what do you mean by have to? This is another example of good testing, but it is not something that is strictly necessary in the sense that there's no button which you have to prove in any meaningful way that you've actually done meaningful validation of whatever you're thinking of deploying. Yes.
But in human-based systems, validation is also generally eschewed. For example, we have a new tax code. We didn't look at how the tax code was really going to do because we had limited information. We just invented the tax code and...
The new one or the old one?
Pardon?
The new one. Yeah. Right. I agree that validation is regularly avoided in all sorts of human-based systems. And I think something that a lot of these comments are pointing towards is a question of what we're assuming algorithms will do that humans cannot or do not. Right? Are we assuming that algorithms are going to be making better choices than humans? Are we assuming the people who are generating and designing these algorithms are going to do more careful testing than humans or human-based systems? And I don't have good answers to those questions, right? But I can say that there are at least two concerns, which I think are very important to point out when we're talking about decisions made by one or very small number of machine learning models when compared to humans making the same sorts of choices, even if they face similar biases, right? So something that's pretty fascinating is the extent to which humans do not like to question the choices and predictions made by machines, right? Again, this is some really strange psychological feature of humans. We're much more likely to question one another and the decisions one another make than humans writ large are willing to believe that a prediction a computer makes, even though it could be simulating something much, much worse, right, than the human making the same sorts of choices. And so that draws a lot of concerns, right? In all of these examples of criminal justice reform using machine learning models, it may very well be the case that the judge would have made the right choice, but the judge gives a lot of deference to the models that are being provided to the judge.
But on the other hand, we at least know the inputs going into the decision. It's a smaller set. And who thought that lunch mattered?
That's right. Humans are
Before lunch.
absolutely. So
At least
right.
It's fair in the sense that it's the same decision given the same inputs, and that's not true of people.
Okay, yeah. So the comment was that to entirely encapsulate what's happening with the machine learning method, it's sufficient to know the model, the algorithm, the training data, and the inputs for this decision. I would push back a little bit in that there's a lot of stochasticity in a lot of these algorithms. So, it won't make the same deterministic choice given the same exact data, right? So many of the, I do want to push back on that to begin with. And second of all, while it's the case that humans have like many more inputs than we can possibly model, that actually points to the second thing, which I think is important, which is that the extent to which we think, some humans may have mistakes, may make mistakes, may be much more harsh before lunch, may be racist, may be sexist, may be any number of other things. But they are limited in the extent and rate to which they themselves can make decisions in any particular circumstance, right? So like you are hungry before lunch and then you go eat lunch, and then when you come back from lunch, you're being, more lenient, right? Which is to say the people before lunch definitely got hosed, but the people after lunch are perhaps getting some better treatment. And a machine learning model may have much more uniform answers, which could be a good thing, but could also be problematic, right? If you're someone who belongs to a class of people who were historically denied home loans, if those choices were being made in a non-formulaic way by a collection of bank employees, and some of them were racist or sexist, you could go to a different bank. I'm not saying that would have been a solution in a lot of cases historically, right? In a lot of cases, there were formulae which were explicitly trying to exclude large fractions of the population from getting home loans. But if we imagine we're in a world today and there are some people who are making bad choices, there are other people who can make different choices, right? Whereas if there's sort of one foundational data set and a small number of models trained on that data set making all of these choices, you don't really have an alternative or a competitor to turn towards. Yeah. Okay. So I think it's important to think about any tool which uses historical data, this is what I'm sort of calling a machine learning algorithm, to predict, explain, or make decisions. So it's really, really, really crucial that we think about the data we are training on, right? We've all been alluding to this and poking at it in various ways. But this is not something, in many cases, that people think all that much about. It's like, oh, well, we all of this data was available on Flickr. So we gathered a bunch of the data on Flickr, and then we see it kind of works in some other environment, not just like examples that are gathered from Flickr. But I think it's really critical that we think about, well, if we use loan repayment rates for different populations as input to our choices for who to give loans today, there are a huge number of historical concerns that come from that. Okay. So I want to, again, just make some brief comment about the extent to which anything in our legal system may be able to be used to address some of the behaviors of machine learning systems as they pertain to varying based on gender, race, other protected attributes. And the short answer is this will probably not be an easy solution. As we are all aware, the legal system has a very difficult time figuring out what to do with systems that don't have agency to begin with, right? So much of case law depends upon intent. And it's very hard to say who has what kind of intent when you have a very complex system, such as some company training some very complex model on some large-scale data set, right? It's not clear who had intent and who's ultimately responsible for some of those things. There are a few exceptions, right? So I've been poking a lot at two of them that we may actually have some hope that the law would have something to say. Housing, lending, employment, and the criminal justice system are examples where the law may have something to say, even if there's no intent and even if we don't get to know a huge amount about the process by which those decisions are being made. Those are all cases in which input-output pairs and distributions of those and statistics about those may be sufficient to argue that a machine learning method is doing something which may not stand up to legal challenge. But most of the other settings where we're thinking about this, medicine or many other things, the law will have very little to say unless we have a lot more information about models. Yes?
So on the subject of law, there was a decision yesterday in the state of Arizona
About self-driving cars?
Killing this woman.
Yeah.
And the decision was that there had been no violation of law, and nobody was criminally or civilly liable.
Yeah. Right. And this is.
But
Yeah.
I point out that it was a woman. It was not a man. It was not a wealthy man. And it was a homeless woman.
Yep.
So
Who is jaywalking? Shame on her. She deserves to be.
population.
I thought the decision said that the observer driver was possibly liable. That the AI vendors and the people who owned the car weren't, but the person behind the wheel was supposed to take charge.
Right. So there's.
He was watching a video instead.
Yeah, so there's definitely, I am not a legal scholar, let me be perfectly clear, nowhere close to it. I know next to nothing about what the law can do, will do, may do in these contexts. It's definitely interesting to understand when a human is interacting with a system that often does the right thing but sometimes does not, whether the human who's ultimately supposed to be the backup is liable when the system fails, right? And this is the example where a mostly autonomous car, which was supposed to have a backup human driver, when that runs over and kills a woman, who's responsible? And that is not established law. This is the first example of one of these things, and it's going to be the process of determining who is liable is going to be contentious. And with that, actually, so I'm going to say one or two more things, and then I actually want to talk about one specific provocative example. So as we're sort of suggesting, not all mistakes of a machine learning system are created equal. Again, going back to this question of what are we optimizing, right? Average 0-1 loss is probably not what we're trying to optimize in almost any context where we've been discussing. False positives are relatively costless when we're thinking about self-driving cars. If we're talking about a positive label as, is there a human, should I stop? Whereas false negatives cause people to be killed. So it's really important to think about sort of the cost of different types of mistakes. I don't want to suggest that we should try to avoid using machine learning in any context possible, but that it's important that we really grapple with these socio-technical things as well as the technical concerns that come from machine learning. There's lots of fun and cool research questions in this space. So I want to, hold on one moment. Oh, this works, excellent. I just updated my software, so I didn't know if this was going to work. Okay. So the thing I want to talk to you about, we only have 15 or 20 minutes left. These slides, if I were talking by myself, would not take 15 or 20 minutes to go through, but I would imagine interaction from you guys will probably make this take at least 15 or 20 minutes, but I'll just stop when we're out of time. So the one thing I want to tell you a little bit about, which is like an active piece of my personal research, is very, very new. Just posted it to arXiv Thursday, which is joint with Ben Wilson, who's an excellent student at Georgia Tech, and Judy Hoffman, who will be starting as faculty at Georgia Tech in the fall, and she did her PhD just across the bay. And I'm very excited to hear more about what all of you think about this. So with that caveat, those caveats. Okay. So what I want to talk to you about briefly, which we've been talking around a little bit, is this idea of using machine learning systems to do driving-centric object detection, right? Which is to say, if the simplest, the wild simplification of this task is that we have a bunch of static images taken from the vantage point of a car or a self-driving car or something like this. And the machine learning task that we're trying to accomplish is to draw bounding boxes around other cars, around bicycles, around riders of those bicycles, around pedestrians, around stop signs, around stoplights, and then label them as such, okay? So this is like a pretty well-formed computer vision task, right? If this is like, if the inputs are these and this is the objective of some system, right? I'll give you an example here, right? So, here's an example of an image taken from the vantage point of a car, as well as being, sort of partitioning the space into different objects that are important for thinking about driving and being labeled as, cars, motorcycles, riders, stoplights, things like that. So this is a pretty standard vision task at this point if you're talking about like academic research in the vision community. And I started with a hypothesis, which was based on other evidence I'd seen in other vision domains, which was that we would expect to see error rates of systems of this variety vary systematically across skin tones, right? So I alluded at the beginning and talked briefly about Amazon's facial recognition system having lots of false positives when run on Congress pictures, and that those were much more common amongst people of color. And I also mentioned, right, this example of Google tagging facial images of African Americans as gorillas. Actually, funny side story, not funny, but Google for a time was just entirely removing the tag gorilla from their image labeling as opposed to like trying to fundamentally understand why their system was doing that and trying to change it.
Try not to get sued.
This is like the min edit distance thing. Yeah, that's right. But it doesn't mean they understood why it was happening and had a meaningful fix. Right? That may not be true anymore, but that was true up to maybe 2 years after this discovery. And there's also work that has shown that several commercially available pieces of software based on facial recognition are much more likely to correctly classify faces to the correct gender for lighter-skinned men than darker-skinned women. Right? So we have a bunch of examples specifically in the context of computer vision systems, relatively simple supervised tasks where computer vision systems seem to work better on lighter-skinned individuals. Right? So for this reason, I had this hypothesis.
My understanding about the field of facial recognition is that systems that make three-dimensional models
two-dimensional. You're not just basing anything on skin tone or anything like that. And yeah, you should be able to separate gender based on 3D models, but that's not going to probably be far from perfect. But,
Yeah, so
2D thing is just ridiculous.
well, right. So there's definitely a question of whether we should be doing facial recognition on two-dimensional representations of faces at all. We have a lot of evidence that it doesn't work particularly well in certain contexts, and it works worse for some demographic groups than others. And yet this is still something that Amazon is actively selling to law enforcement agencies. So you can argue that it's a good thing to do or a bad thing to do, but it is something people are doing. Which is, yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Tell us, I'm waiting for the,
Okay, well, I have to tell you a little bit more about how we were going to do this, right? So I wanted to know how we can test this. And I really wanted to ask this on common classes of models used for this in academia and common data sets that are considered in academia, which are generally used for this driving-centric object detection, okay? So if you're someone who knows what these are, that's great. If you don't, that's fine too. These are just, the first things are classes of models that are generally used for driving-centric object detection in like current computer vision papers being published. The next two things, the first one's a driving-centric object data set. The other one's just a more general purpose image recognition data set. Okay? Okay. Lots of other details, right? So this data set and most data sets don't actually explicitly have demographic tagging in them, so we had to do a bunch of things to actually have some of that information to even be able to test this hypothesis. Right? So the experiment was to fix a class of models, an optimization method, a training data set, all of which are pretty standard in this domain, and measures of performance, which are common to evaluate the veracity of how well a computer vision system is working, broken out by a specific notion of skin type. Okay? So I'll give you a few images. These are not meant to give you any meaningful information other than, these are just bounding boxes we've drawn around pedestrians. There are some funny things. There's a false positive up here where the pedestrian, this system thinks this 30-foot blow-up rat is a pedestrian. So in short, there is likely to be some difference in this very specific context, right? So it appears that there is some gap in terms of the average precision and the finer grained AP75 measures. These are just specific measures that people do when trying to understand how well these sorts of bounding box problems are operating, where we see that the lighter skinned pedestrians, both in terms of AP and AP75, the red lines are above the blue lines, which is to say the average precision numbers are somewhat higher for this very specific thing which I did. Okay. Yeah.
So it seemed to me that one sort of obvious test would be go in and paint the faces differing
Yeah.
colorations and then see what happens.
Yeah, so the comment was it would be very interesting to change the skin tone of the pedestrians in some of our examples and see what would happen. My guess is it would totally break. And the reason I say that is I don't know of a way to do that where the examples would look enough like the examples they were trained upon. And most of the vision systems we're talking about, these in particular, but the ones that are being trained and are like state of the art in general, are very, very, very sensitive to very small changes in training data or test data.
We'll pick it up afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but I agree that one of the interesting questions is like the extent to which we could try to understand when this will and will not happen, right? And let me be clear, because I know many of you are trained in a variety of different things. These are results that are reported on validation, right? So we trained on one data set. These are the results we found on validation for this very particular data set. And these are not, I have no error bars here, which pains me very deeply, right? I don't say that with 95% confidence I see this gap. This gap is one standard deviation away from what you might expect if they were equal. The reason I still think it's important and critical to point this out as a possible problem, even though we don't have statistical significance, is the fact that in order to have statistical significance for a gap of, say, 5 to 10% difference in average precision, we would need roughly 15,000 images. Does someone have $100,000 they'd like to give me? Because I would be happy to gather that data set, right? And I think the onus is really upon people who are planning to make millions and millions and millions of dollars off of these things to invest some in an independent third party to carefully evaluate how well the models are going to work. Yeah?
So, just so I understand the definition of success, does it mean if it's successful, a box was drawn around the pedestrian?
So-
And if it was not successful, there was no box drawn?
No. It's a much more fine-grained version. So average precision looks at the intersection over the union of the area of these bounding boxes. There's a ground truth bounding box. There's the box you drew. It's certainly a particularly bad error if there was a bounding box and you didn't draw one, or there wasn't a bounding box and you drew one. But in general, what's interesting is how much space do they overlap upon? And this is some complex blend of several different ways to look at those numbers, right? So this is not saying that like out of 100 lighter skinned pedestrians, we would see X, and out of 100 darker skinned pedestrians, we would see X minus 5. It's saying something more precise than that and more about like small differences in terms of how well we draw bounding boxes. Okay.
And if you're in a car, a few inches on a box could be the difference between losing an arm or not losing an arm, right? So it makes sense.
Yep. Right. I mean, right. Yes or no is not the only answer that matters. Where? Yeah. So, if you prefer numbers that are drawn like this rather than charts, these are just what the differences after some large number of training rounds ends up looking like, training iterations looks like. So as I mentioned, right, AP and AP75, which are the least and most fine-grained in terms of localization of these three metrics, seem to have some reasonably sized gaps in terms of the percentage of these metrics when you look at light-skinned versus darker-skinned pedestrians. And again, these are not error bars. These are just the particular algorithms that are used to train these models are randomized. So you have to imagine training them several times and seeing sort of what you might expect that gap to look like as you train them multiple times. Okay? So a natural question one might ask, and I think I'll finish right on time, is why we might expect this to be happening, right? And if you talk to, it's really actually quite fascinating the extent to which people have like different opinions about why this might be happening. And as I mentioned, right, we're not saying anything with like high degrees of statistical power here. So I'm not saying that like I know or don't know these things, but I do have some preliminary evidence that may suggest what may or may not be at least partially responsible. Okay. So one of the first things that you or anyone who thinks about vision might think about is that contrast between the thing you're trying to draw a bounding box around and the color of the background that they are on is incredibly important and makes, if there's less contrast, it's a harder task to draw an accurate bounding box around a subject. So one thing that we did was we removed all nighttime images and only looked at daylight, and we still saw this behavior, right? So it doesn't seem that like the problems come from nighttime images where there's much less contrast between darker-skinned individuals and their surroundings. Another general thing that makes vision tasks harder is when there are lots and lots of images all on top of each other. One of the example images I had there was in Times Square, and there were like lots and lots of people all on top of each other, and it's harder for humans too, right? It's not super easy to draw really precise boxes when there are lots and lots of subjects of your image. But this gap seems to persist even if we remove all of the occlusion is just the word for this, right? If you remove all of the occluded individuals from your data set, right? And you could imagine, again, that like maybe all of the people of a certain demographic group live in very occluded neighborhoods. I'm not saying this is the case, but like people might argue that this was the case. And this does not seem to be primarily the source of this behavior. people may separately wonder, right, like what's the gap in terms of how many lighter versus darker skinned pedestrians are in the training set? And the answer is it's somewhere between 3 and 4 to 1, right? Because this particular data set, which was collected by researchers at Berkeley, was collected in the Bay Area, New York, Tel Aviv, maybe one or two other places, but they were not primarily gathered in, for example, Atlanta, right? And so 3 or 4 to 1 is pretty representative compared to a lot of data sets we have, just in general, right? But it is not particularly balanced in some other senses. Okay, so you might ask whether we're sort of just not given enough data to do particularly well in terms of the smaller population. And I have, again, limited information and limited understanding, but it does not appear to me that we are primarily just like running into not being able to do any better on this smaller set. Okay, so, you know, I'm not trying to say that self-driving cars are much more likely to harm certain people than others. That is the sensational hot take of this particular work, but I am saying this kind of vision system, when trained on publicly available data sets as opposed to the proprietary data sets that self-driving cars are competing with one another to collect, may have better performance on different types of pedestrians. And we really need to understand this phenomenon better, and we need the resources given from people who are really standing in a place to make a lot of money from using these kinds of systems to more carefully evaluate both the industry standard and the academic standard types of models and data sets, right? And more broadly, right, and this again goes back to several comments that have been made throughout this presentation, it's very important that we carefully, very, very carefully, painstakingly evaluate all parts of our machine learning systems in environments that are as close as possible to those they will actually be deployed in, right? If we hope to understand how well they will behave. Oh, that's fine, I don't care.